Now that you've learned a little bit more about sequences in general, one thing that you also have to know about sequences is you could actually write them in different ways. So like you can write the sequence out like you saw in the other video where you had just the sequence. But some other ways that you could write sequences is you could actually write equations that would represent your sequence as well. And so that's what we're going to start working on. And today we're going to start by writing what's called recursive equations of our sequences, okay? So recursion in general is the process of describing the next term. So it's a process telling you how to find the next term in a sequence, but it's in relation to the preceding terms. So it's telling you how to find a term in your sequence by looking at the terms that are before that term, okay? And so when you write what's called the recursive formula, what you're doing is you're telling what to do to go from one term in your sequence to the next term, okay? So just kind of some reminders of some of the notation. So let's say that you have a sequence. So I didn't actually put numbers, but you're kind of looking at your sequence. And remember that A with the little subscript of an N is to represent a term in your sequence. And remember the N is going to be the position of the term. And so if I was just describing each of these terms, this would be my first term. So you would label this one as my A sub 1 term. This would be the second term in my sequence. So I would label it with an A with a little subscript of a 2. This was the third term, so that'd be an A with a subscript of a 3. And then this is my fourth, so it'd be A sub 4. And then we could keep going. So like this would be the fifth term, then the sixth, then the seventh, and so on and so forth. And so we are going to be using this notation to help us write these recursive equations or recursive formulas, okay? So before we can actually do that, I want you to kind of understand how it works, okay? So again, you're telling what to do to go from one term to get to the next term. So like, let's say that whenever we figured out the pattern of this sequence, we were adding 2, just to keep it simple. So if we were adding 2, then the recursive formula is going to tell you, well, you're taking one term and you have to add 2 to get to the next term. So like a way of writing that is you would say, okay, for this equation, you would take one of your terms and you would have to add 2 to it. I don't know why I keep doing that. I'm sorry. You'd have to add 2 to that, whatever that number is, and that would give you that next term, okay? So that's kind of using the notation. Now, a lot of times we will end up putting this part first. So like a lot of times you will see it written as to find the second term, you take the term right before it and add 2. So a lot of times you'll see it like that. But that's kind of what we're doing here. But instead of actually being specific about our terms, we're going to end up using this notation, okay? So remember, this is just to represent a general term in your sequence. And so whenever you are writing it, what you're doing is saying, okay, what do I do to find a term in my sequence? Well, just kind of like what we talked up here, you're going to take the term that's right before it, and if this was the pattern, then you would be taking that and adding 2. But how do you write, if you're being very general, how do you write the term that's right before that one? Well, think about this. This is the position of it. So if this was a term in my sequence, so like if A sub n was some term in my sequence, then what do I do to the position of this to find the term that's right before it? Well, look at how these relate. So like to go from this term to go back to here, we'd have to take 3 and subtract 1 from the position of it to get back here, right? So the term that would be right before that one would be the A with a subscript of n minus 1, because this is the position right before that one, okay? So one way that you're going to see to write the recursive formula, to find a term, you take the term right before that one, which that's how you write that, and you would have to add 2, okay? So we will kind of practice this more, but that's where, when you see these two notations, that's where that's coming from, okay? So let's actually kind of get into how to write recursive formulas, all right? So to write a recursive equation, you have to do two things, okay? You're going to, number one, start by writing the equation, and there's two different ways that you can write it. And at the same time, you also have to tell a term that's in your sequence. And so the reason for that is because as to what your sequence starts with, or what the sequence looks like, you have to give one of the numbers that's in your sequence, or it may not work. Like a lot of different types of sequences can have the same pattern, but they may not have exactly the same numbers. And so this will help you to kind of specify what your sequence, what types of numbers your sequence is going to have in it, okay? And so just make sure that you write the equation and you tell a number in your sequence, okay? So now what does that look like? Well, when you write your formula, there's going to be one of two ways that you can write it. This way that I just talked about is the formal way of writing it. When you get into other classes, you're going to be writing it more in a formal way. In this class, you may see that it's written in a more informal way, okay? So we're going to actually start with the informal way. So when you write the equation, let's say, we're just going to write an example here. Let's say that the equations, or the sequence, starts with a 3, and we'll stick with this same pattern. You're adding 2. So if I was adding 2, the next one would be 5, and then 7, and then 9, and then so on and so forth, okay? So if this was our sequence, and I had to describe it or write the equation in a recursive way, remember you're telling what to do to go from one term to the next, what you have to do first is find the pattern. Well, what is the pattern that we're following here? Well, we're adding 2. And so that's where you start. And then you're going to write the equation. So the equation in an informal way is you are describing it in terms of your next term and the term you have now. Okay, so how do you write that? Well, you start with, okay, to get my next term, so like if I'm going from one term to the next, and I was trying to find my next term, so that's where that comes from, what is that going to equal? What do I have to do to the term that I have now? So now the term, this part is representing like where you are. So like if I'm trying to find the next term, I would technically be right here at the 9, and I'm asking myself, okay, what do I do to what I have now to get to the next term? Well, what I have to do is I have to add 2. So you take what you have now and add 2. So that's the formula, is to find the next term, I take what I have now and add 2, okay? So that's the informal way of writing it. If I wanted to write it in a formal way, that's where you're going to use the a sub n and the a sub n minus 1. So the a sub n would kind of be the same thing as like your next term in this case, okay? And then the a sub n minus 1 would be kind of like what your now term is, okay? So to find your term in your sequence, so to find a general term in your sequence, you have to take the term right before it. And in this problem, what are we doing to go from one term to the next? Well, we're adding 2. So you have to take the previous term and add 2, okay? So remember, this is like a term in your sequence. So it'd be like in this problem, the next term. And then this would be the previous term. So that is the formal way of writing it. That's the informal way of writing it, okay? So that's the equation part. So now I told you that you will also have to tell one of your terms in your sequence. Usually, when they do this, they will write their first term. So I just want you to get in the habit of writing what the first term is. So if you're writing it in an informal way, you would write down where it starts. So in this sequence, where does it start? Well, it starts with 3. So you would say the starting term equals 3. And so you would put it right beside the informal equation. And then the formal equation, you have to write it using this notation. So usually we'll tell our first term. You don't actually have to tell the first term. You just have to tell a term in your sequence. But usually they'll write the first term. So you would write down the a sub 1 term. The first term in your sequence would be 3. Okay, and so that would go with the formal way. Okay, so now we're going to just practice this with some examples so you can see kind of how to put this together. So with each sequence that we do, we are going to practice writing the informal way and the formal way of writing it. Okay, so when you see a sequence and they tell you to write the recursive formula, you're going to start by finding the pattern. So what's going on to go from one term to the next? Are you adding? Are you subtracting, multiplying, dividing by the same number? That's what you got to find out. So to go from -2 to 1, 1 to 4, 4 to 7. Okay, well, I usually start with adding. Am I adding the same number? And I will notice that I'm adding 3. And now remember, if you end up adding the same number and you can't find it, you can take one term minus the one before it, and you'll figure out what it is. Like 4 minus 1 gives me 3, right? So you could figure out that, hey, I have to add 3, right? But find the pattern first, okay? Then you're going to be able to write the equation. So the informal way, remember, is the next and now stuff. So you're telling what you do to the term you have now to get to the next term. Okay, and it has to do with a pattern. So the informal way of writing it, to find the next term, that's going to equal what I have now, and I'm doing something to it. So like imagine that you were trying to go from one term to the next term. So if I'm taking this term, that's the term I have now, what am I doing to it? What am I going to have to do to it to get to the next term? Well, I'd have to take what I have now and add 3. So that is the equation. And then remember, the other thing that you have to write is this part. You have to tell a term in your sequence. So we usually tell where it starts. So you'll go right underneath it and you'll say, okay, it starts at, so where does it start? Well, the first term here is -2. So it starts at -2. So that's telling whoever's reading this to start at -2, and you're going to add 3 to build that sequence. And so that's the reason why that represents that sequence. So now the formal way of writing it, remember you're using the a sub n and the a sub n minus 1. So to find a term in my sequence, so you'll start by writing the a sub n. To find a term, I take the previous term. So remember this right here represents the previous term. You have to take the previous term, and what am I doing? Well, I have to take the previous term and add 3 to get to the next term. So I'm going to take that one and add 3. And make sure that this is a subscript. Don't write it as regular. It should be kind of below the line. So make sure that that looks like a subscript, okay? So you're taking the previous term and adding 3 to get to the next term. And then, just like the other one, you have to tell a term in your sequence. So we usually write down the first term. So the first term in that sequence equals -2. So those are the two different ways that you could write a recursive formula. Okay, so let's practice it just a couple more times. Okay, what about this sequence? Well, what am I doing to go from one term to the next? Figure that out first. And so it looks like it's decreasing. So that means I'm either going to be maybe like subtracting a number or possibly maybe dividing, but I actually know I'm not dividing because it turns into negatives, and the only way that it would be negatives is if it was rotating, and I'll explain that in a bit, but it is decreasing. So I'm going to see, is it subtracting? So like to go from 5 to 1, I'd have to subtract 4. So what we're going to do is see if that pattern kind of follows all the way through. So if I take 1 and I subtract 4, do I get -3? Yeah, I do. And so from there, I'm going to check it again because it has to go all the way, the pattern has to go all the way through. So like -3, if I subtract 4, do I get -7? And yeah, so that would be another arithmetic sequence, because remember, arithmetic, you're either adding or subtracting a constant number, okay? So The informal way of writing it, you're using your next and now stuff. So to get to the next term, what am I going to do to what I have now? So it's going to be the next term would equal what I have now, and then what are we doing to it? Well, we're subtracting 4. So I have to take what I have now and subtract 4. And then you just go below it and you write down where it starts. So it started at 5. So that would be the informal way of writing it. The formal way of writing it, well, to get a term in my sequence, I have to take the previous term and do something to it. So to get to the term in my sequence, I have to take the term right before that, and I have to subtract 4. So like I'd have to take this term and subtract 4 to get to the next term. So just another way of writing it. And then you have to tell your first term. So my first term is equal to 5. Okay, so that is the formal way of writing it. Remember, this is your previous term. That would be the term that's right after that one. Okay, so it's kind of the same thing as what you're doing here. It's just a different way of writing it. Okay, so what about this last one? What's the pattern here? And something that I was just talking about a second ago, do you see how like these signs are alternating between like that one's negative, that one's positive, negative, positive? When that's happening, what's actually going on is you're probably multiplying or dividing by a negative number, okay? Because that's the only thing that's going to make that happen. So, well, we just have to figure out what that number is. And so if you think, okay, what do I multiply negative 3 by to get 9? What do I multiply 9 by to get negative 27? And you can think through it that way. Or if you think you're multiplying by a number, remember I told you the trick here would be you could take one of the terms and divide by the one right before it. And notice when I do that, I get negative 3. So let's check to see if I'm multiplying by negative 3. Well, if I take negative 3 times negative 3, do I get 9? Yep. And if I do it again, so if I take 9 times negative 3, do I get negative 27? Yep. And so, and then I could check this last one, and that will work too. So my pattern would mean that I'm multiplying by negative 3. So that would actually make this a geometric sequence, okay? So when we write the equation, to do it informally, you're going to write it like this. So to find the next term, I'm going to take what I have now, and what am I doing to it? Well, I am multiplying this times negative 3, okay? And then it starts at the beginning term is negative 3, okay? So that's that way of writing it. And then the formal way, to find a term in my sequence, I have to take the term before it, and in this problem I'm multiplying by negative 3, so I'd have to take the term before it and multiply by negative 3. And then the first term would be, well, my first term is negative 3, so it'd be negative 3, okay? The only thing with these problems is they could write it like this, but you also need to know that they could, because you're multiplying, they could take this number and put it in front of that. So like if they rewrote this one, they could rewrite it as, to find the next term, you have to take negative 3 times what you have now. That's like another way of writing it. Do you see how they put the negative 3 in front? Okay. Or this one, they could actually rewrite it with the negative 3 in front of this a sub n minus 1. So it'd look like this. Okay. But it's the same thing. It's just they put the 3 in front instead. Okay.